I'm not playing pro or anti-Trump here. You look at this from the economic point of view, and the economic logic here is that uh, Trump cannot get any type of benefit to the U.S. economy out of playing this, and he's going to further make the move to an economy, a more diversified global economy, in which the U.S. is not off to the side, but people are not necessarily going to see the U.S. as their number one port of call.
Hi, I'm Jo Crawford, and welcome to Times Radio's Trump Report. Today, I'm joined by Scott Lucas, Professor of US Politics at the University College Dublin's Clinton Institute, and also founder and editor of EA Worldview. Thank you for joining me on the Trump Report today.
Thank you so much, Joe. Great to be here.
So, Trump is expected to meet Jordan's King Abdullah at the White House today. It's their first meeting since Trump suggested moving Palestinians in Gaza to Jordan. How do you expect this conversation to go?
I think it's going to be a tricky public appearance. Of course, the real conversation will be behind the scenes. But even in the photo op at the White House, if Trump once again repeats his proposal, which is effectively for ethnic cleansing of people from Gaza, and says, oh, they can go to Jordan because they'll have a lovely life there, it puts King Abdullah in a very difficult bind because Arab countries don't want to take in the Gazans. Uh, there's a number of reasons, but one of them is that if you do that, you effectively give sanction to them being displaced and not being able to possibly ever go back to their homes. There's an important bit of history here. In 1948, during the first Arab-Israeli War, just after the State of Israel was created, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were pushed out of what became Israel. Those Palestinians hoped they would return at one point. They never did. You now have, I think, between 5 and 6 million Palestinians who are the descendants of these people, who are effectively, many of them living in what are large communities, but what initially were refugee camps. These Palestinians are stateless. They have no, as it were, claim to the land that they once lived on back in Israel. Do you want that to happen with Gaza? And when Trump pushed this proposal, and it is a serious proposal in Trump's head, to turn Gaza into resort territory for rich people to go visit and spend money in possibly Trump Tower, he effectively was repeating that line of 1948 for the 21st century. He was actually just erasing the people of Gaza. Um, in addition to that, and that's bad enough, Trump in the past 24 hours has said, well, if Jordan doesn't take in these Gazans, we'll put sanctions on Jordan, which now is Trump's thing. Or sorry, tariffs on Jordan, which is now Trump's line for everything. If someone doesn't do what he wants, oh, tariffs on Canada, tariffs on Mexico, tariffs on the EU. Well, now tariffs on Jordan. And then on top of all of that, the broader story is that what Trump has done is he has effectively confirmed the demolition of the ceasefire process between Hamas and Israel. The getting to phase two was going to be difficult enough. We're in a phase one ceasefire. It has just over 2 weeks to go. Some hostages, Israeli hostages, are freed. Some Palestinian detainees are freed from Israeli prisons. Not only was that to continue in phase two, but here's the tricky part. Israel was to withdraw from Gaza, its military, while Gazans were going to be able to return to government. But neither Israel nor the US want Hamas to be in power. So even before Trump's intervention, it was going to be difficult to how do you square this with the fact that Israel will not withdraw the military if Hamas is still there, but Hamas will not voluntarily leave power. When Trump brought out his ethnic cleansing remarks, what he effectively flagged up is, we don't care about that phase two of the ceasefire. We don't care if Gazans have a government and are in their homes. We want them out. And that meant that when Hamas has said in the last 24 hours, citing what they call are Israeli violations of the current phase, look, we're not going to release any more hostages, you now have the pretext set up for a return to war. Because the Israeli hard right, who did not want phase one of this deal anyway. And this includes ministers connected to Netanyahu's cabinet. The Israeli far right will now say, look, Hamas, they're not going to release more hostages. Netanyahu can say it, they're not going to release more hostages. And Trump, as he said yesterday in his latest flutter, having played the peacemaker, now is saying it's okay for all hell to break loose, to rain all hell on Gaza, as if they haven't suffered enough, which in effect is Trump saying it's okay for Israel to return to the military operations, which have already killed almost 50,000 Gazans since October 2023.
This is what I guess a lot of people are confused about. Why would he, in one hand, throw Netanyahu that political lifeline to potentially reinstigate conflict again, if he likes to have that title as being that peace broker, that deal maker? And again, another perspective as well, he's a anti-war, America first. What incentive is there for Trump to allow for this ceasefire deal to fall through?
Let's walk through this in terms of what appears to be a shift, but in fact, it speaks to Trump's ego, how he presents himself. It is true that Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, worked with the Biden administration to push, in particular, Netanyahu to agree to a phase one. So to that point, the Trump camp deserves credit for that. Now, Trump wanted that for his ego. I'm the peacemaker, blah, blah, blah. And the Biden folks played to that, right? But I said at the start of phase one, and others did as well, look, it's going to be really difficult to get a phase two agreement in particular, because Netanyahu is caught between the families of the hostages who want the hostages back, but he's caught between the finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, who almost quit the cabinet over the phase one, and Mr. Ben-Gvir, his former national security minister, internal security minister, who did leave the cabinet, right? But said, I'll support the government provided there's not a phase two. Now, that was what was happening. Now, at that point, Trump has got no way of bringing phase two about. I mean, he doesn't have the skills. I don't think he has the inclination to want to bring phase two about. So he can't keep getting the credit. So if he can't keep getting the credit, what does he do? What he does is he changes the narrative, and he changes the narrative to put out this ethnic cleansing proposal. And then when you get all this criticism of it, blame Hamas. Blame Hamas, and then unleash Israel, which is pretty much what Trump had wanted to do last autumn anyway. I mean, he told Netanyahu last autumn during the U.S. campaign, Bibi, do what you have to do. Trump is now back at that point anyway, but he has got added incentive, which is if there's not going to be a phase two, I don't want to take the blame. So I'll repackage myself not as the peacemaker, but as the supporter of this campaign against these horrible terrorists, against Hamas.
And obviously Trump has said a lot about what he would want the US to do around Gaza. I mean, a lot of people on the other hand say that we can't always take what he's saying at face value. But how would you say you expect Trump to react and respond if a ceasefire deal does fall through?
Well, let's cut through, first of all, that lines that Trump had some type of brilliant strategic maneuver, or he didn't even mean the lines around ethnic cleansing. Because as always with Trump, let's get the facts down as to what happened here. He did mean that proposal. I mean, I can walk you back to the Trump's first term, where he and his son-in-law Jared Kushner talked about prime waterfront property in Gaza for development. Trump talked about that you could turn North Korean property on the coast into a resort area when he was trying to talk about talking to Kim Jong-un. Trump thinks that way as a businessman. How can I make personal profit out of this? On top of this, last summer, a professor at George Washington University named Joseph Peltzman, he sent the Trump people a proposal, which he later published, which he said is start Gaza from scratch. And by scratch, what he meant is remove everything. And he explicitly said, I don't just mean removing the rubble. I mean removing the people. That was Peltzman's proposal. So you combine Trump's instincts as a businessman. We can own it. We can make profit from it, with the fact that Trump advisors would have this plan to build up Gaza without Gazans. And from what Israeli sources have said, when Trump walked in there last week with Benjamin Netanyahu alongside him, when he said the Gazans have to go, they have to leave, Jared Kushner wrote that statement. So it's a serious proposal. Now, what you're asking me here is that inevitably, phase two of the ceasefire is not going to happen, in part because of this. So do the Trump people have a play beyond this? They don't have a constructive play here, because the constructive play is gone, because Israel is probably going to return to military operations. Those Palestinians who did try to get back into their homes in recent days are going to have to leave their homes again. We're going to be back in the throes of a humanitarian crisis. Trump is not going to want to do anything to terms of putting U.S. aid money in to ease the humanitarian crisis, in part because he and Elon Musk are destroying the U.S. Agency for International Development, absolutely obliterating it. So the Trump play here is, when Trump can't show a positive for his ego, you blame someone else. And the fact here is that his motive to blame Hamas is going to match up with the motives of Israelis on the right who want to renew the war. It's probably going to match up with what Netanyahu's going to want, because he's going to have to face the fact that he will not get the hostages back. So my fear is, when Trump said rain down hell on Gaza, Gaza has had hell rain down on it ever since Hamas killed those Israelis, almost 1,200 Israelis and foreign nationals in October 23, and then the hell in Gaza of almost 50,000 killed, almost 2 million displaced. And you know what? It could be an even bigger hell that rains down on Gaza, but Trump will portray himself as being the defender of Israel against Hamas. And a lot of Americans will buy into that narrative. I think Trump can get away with the short-term idea of backing Netanyahu, even if it in many ways isolates the U.S. and Israel. But I think he sets up for wider trouble here, which has to do with regional policy in the Middle East. By this, I'm not talking about an Israel war with Iran. Iran's too weak right now. It suffered major losses. But remember that the Trump play was the idea that Israel could normalize relations with Arab states. So Israel, of course, already has the peace agreement with Jordan. They have the peace agreement with Egypt, going back to the Camp David Accords. But we were talking about Israel normalizing with the Gulf states, especially Saudi Arabia. That's gone. That's absolutely gone. I mean, the Saudis are not going to normalize relations with Israel unless there's a Gaza ceasefire and at least a statement in principle of going for a two-state solution. The UAE, Bahrain, Kuwait, they're not going to normalize with Israel. Jordan's caught in the middle of this. Now, Jordan's not going to walk away from its peace treaty with Israel, but there is going to be trouble not only in Gaza, there's trouble in the West Bank, which of course borders Jordan. We've had several hundred Palestinians killed in the West Bank in the past 16 months. And right now, Israel's in the middle of a deadly operation in Jenin in there. Jordan faces the prospect of internal instability because people are going to get upset with this. So what Trump has done is, in his way, is he's destabilized not only Gaza, he has destabilized the region, but not in the ways we tend to think of it. Will there be war? He's destabilized it in that you're going to have internal conflict within these countries, and you're going to have Arab states that are going to separate themselves from Israel.
It's an interesting point, because it's often seen that, the power in Jordan is the fact that they have that peace and that stability within the region, and potentially, Trump threatening to destabilize that. That's a negotiating tactic there from Trump. And obviously we will find out a bit more about that when they do speak later. Moving on to tariffs. So Trump, he's threatened a 25% import tax on all steel and aluminium entering the US to start in March. He implemented similar tariffs last time that he was in office. And that in turn, sustudies have found that it raised the average price of these metals within the US. There's contention about how successful that tariff was in achieving, the aims and objectives that Trump stated. I mean, do you see Trump actually going through with this tariff this time?
Well, Trump, he issued the order for the tariffs. Now, you now have to go into executing the order, and we have to see whether Trump tries to play this as a negotiating tactic. And if the Canadians beg him, which is what he wants, or the Mexicans beg him to remove, or the UK, which is also hit by this, beg him, whether he pulls back on it. But for now, not only has he gone back to the 25% tariffs, he's gone further. Because remember, there were exemptions for Canada and Mexico under the original Trump orders. There are no exemptions this time. There's no exemption for the UK. European producers are being hit as well. The Japanese, whose prime minister was just in Washington trying to flatter Trump, they've been hit. This is where it gets serious. I mean, if you walk it back to a week ago, which seems like an eternity, when Trump made that initial threat of hitting the Canadians and the Mexicans across the board, and they pushed back on him, and he got almost nothing out of that. There was always the chatter that the Trump team was not really looking at general tariffs; they were looking at sector by sector. Well, now they've done steel and aluminium, and if steel and aluminium work, they might pick on another sector. No one wins in a trade war. So the U.S. is going to take damage from this because those sectors that use steel are going to have to pay a higher price. And we're talking about the automobile industry. We're talking about manufacturing. We're talking about agriculture. They all are going to be affected. Sometimes it takes time for that hit to percolate through. So what Trump is doing is he's playing the game that he can get a political win out of this before the economic damage becomes apparent. But I think the early signals are right now that nobody's going to cave on this. Canada's not going to cave. Mexico's not going to cave. The EU's not going to cave. I think the only country that may cave on this is the UK, which has been really striking that although it has the Labour government, has actually been bending over to appease Trump to the extent, on a completely different topic, which we can pick up later on, that they have joined the U.S. in refusing to sign the Accord on Artificial Intelligence that's coming out of Paris today, because the Trump people are saying, oh, why does the European Union have protection of personal data? Why would they do that? It prohibits information from getting out there. Just all kinds of fluff from Vice President Vance, and the UK siding alongside him. So we'll see how the UK responds on the steel tariffs. UK Steel has actually said this will be a serious damage. But I think right now Trump is playing bully boy. And I think where he's miscalculating is that people are going to let him get away with it. I think there are going to be some people that are going to hold the line and probably even punch back. And I think the EU is going to be among them.
Yeah, and we have heard from the EU that they will respond to this. Canada as well, they said that they will stand up against this from the US. But then we are seeing several countries who are trying to engage in talks with Trump. So South Korea, for example, they're allegedly the fourth biggest exporter of steel to the US. Also, apparently, the Australia is trying to negotiate some sort of carve-out deal there. I mean, it suggests that these countries, they are worried.
Yeah, I mean, the question here is what Trump's going to want to give them the carve out, and whether it's going to be politically and economically a way out for these countries. All right, so what's he going to demand of the Australians? What's he going to demand of the South Koreans? Now, how Mexico and Canada avoided the general tariffs last week is they gave Trump a couple of shiny things that were absolutely meaningless. So just as a reminder, the Mexicans said, oh, yeah, okay, we'll send some National Guard up to the border, blah, right? And then the Canadians talked about a $1.3 billion package on border security, more personnel, more technology, which they had agreed, which they had unrolled back in December. And apparently Trump never noticed it, right? Do Australia and South Korea have like token gestures they can make into which they're going to get the carve out? It's going to be difficult here because, fact of the matter here is if you carve out South Korea and you carve out Australia, I think there'll be some Americans will say, wait a minute, why are they getting the carve outs, but Canada and Mexico aren't? And, he's setting himself up for a real mess here. What will save him in this case here is that the markets and business expected him to do something like this. So you won't get the bad stock market news that he got last week when he tried to make the general play. And that's what the Trump people are banking on. If you go sector by sector, uh, it's like boiling the frog slowly. You don't get real pushback. We'll see how it plays here, but I'll tell you this right now, that the wider thing that I would be looking at is the state of the U.S. economy, and there's already one major uh, financial house, which is they had been predicting that U.S. GDP would grow this year, and they've actually withdrawn that. They say at this point they were expecting the U.S. growth rate of 2.2% to increase. They've now said they expect it to remain level at best. If that type of continues through financial sector, and if it affects consumer confidence, Trump's going to have way bigger problems than tariffs to think about.
How much of this is a protectionist strategy by Trump? He's cited national security as a key reason for these tariffs, saying that they were trying to stop countries like China and Russia from avoiding these tariffs. How do you see that coming into effect?
Well, wait a minute. Let's call bull on this. How much Russian steel or Chinese steel was being sent via the European Union into the United States? Or how much steel was being sent via Canada or Mexico? That's absolute rubbish. Not that Trump would know the term of that, nice British phrase. That's just simply a pretext here, right? And then let's call out the broader line that they use. They keep saying, oh, we've got to reclaim our money with these tariffs. What they're actually saying here is the U.S. runs a very large trade deficit. Now, it doesn't run a large trade deficit because the U.S. is being ripped off. It runs a large trade deficit because American consumers, American manufacturers, American agricultural producers demand a lot of imports for their needs, and the amount of imports they demand for their needs exceeds the amount of American exports. That's a fundamental economic fact. Now, if you want to slap tariffs on to recoup the American trade deficit, you're not going to increase American exports. That's not going to happen. People are not going to buy more of your products if you slap tariffs on. What you're hoping is you would have to have a massive decrease in what you import into the country. Now, that's going to mean two things. One is it's going to mean that tariffs cannot replace income tax. That's an absolutely bogus argument. And secondly, it does not mean that you're going to improve the U.S. economy, because you're going to be hitting people in terms of things that they need. The argument for tariffs, and I'd say probably the primary argument for tariffs, is when you have a young industry which is trying to get on its feet and it faces already established foreign competitors, that means it can never grow. You might have a specific case, which is you might say, well, U.S. Steel, even though it has long been established, we really need that industry to revive and to pick up. So we're going to put tariffs on foreign steel so that U.S. Steel could pick up. You could make an argument like that. But that's not what the Trump people are doing. They've made no sensible argument along those lines. And let us call out what this is. This is not an economic move. It does not make economic sense. This is a political move. It's a political move to make Trump look tough, to try to make other countries kiss his backside, and then him claim credit for it. And if other countries don't play along with it, that political move is not going to work.
So the EU has vowed it will respond to these tariffs, but also there's suggestions there that it might push the EU towards more unlikely partnerships with countries like India, within South America, maybe even China. What do you make of that?
It's not just a suggestion, it's happening. I mean, I'll tell you this right now. I mean, if the U.S. simply says, oh, we're putting tariffs on all of your products, you're going to look to send your products to other places who are then going to say, we want to send our products to you. The assumption of the Trump folks that this is a U.S.-led global economy, and the U.S. has a lot of strength, we know that, but the assumption that they can just dominate the economy like that doesn't necessarily hold. So the countries right now, I mean, you want to look at the Chinese press, go look at the Chinese media in English and look at how they are crowing over these tariffs, even though they've been hit by them. Remember, they have been hit by them. They're absolutely crawling over the fact that Trump would do this to his allies, or to America's allies, not Trump's, because it opens up opportunities for them. And remember that the EU has always been different from the US in terms of where it went economically with China. Certain countries like Germany have not pulled back from their economic position completely. So I think you see China playing in there. I think India is going to make a big move because India doesn't carry the stigma of China. And it also has a very large economy where it can actually, with a lot of new industry that it's trying to promote. I think you're going to see reconfigurations with Canada and Mexico. And those would be logical partners for the EU to look at as well. In other words, you bypass the US. Now, that's not, easy. You have to realign your trade relationships. It takes time to do so. But Trump is pushing people into that position because you're facing the prospect those tariffs might not be on for a few weeks, a few months. He might keep them on for years. So, this again is, I'm not playing pro or anti-Trump here. You look at this from the economic point of view, and the economic logic here is that Trump cannot get any type of benefit to the U.S. economy out of playing this, and he's going to further make the move to an economy, a more diversified global economy in which the U.S. is not off to the side, but people are not necessarily going to see the U.S. as their number one port of call.
Scott Lucas, thank you for joining me on the Trump Report today.
Thank you so much, Joe.